Hello, I'm Tom Garreau, president of the Global Coral Reef Alliance, and I want to show you here how Biorock Electrotherapy saves corals from heat stroke death in Indonesia. And I'm going to show you our results from last year, 2016, in Indonesia. Now, global warming is a serious problem. Here are global temperatures from 1997 to 2015. 2015 was the hottest year in history until this year, 2016, which is even higher. So what we're seeing is a steady increase in heat. Actually, interesting enough, it's not steady. It goes in jumps. What happened is that there was a big El Nino in 1998. The temperature shot up to a record level, and then it's kind of fluctuated and it's been fairly stable around that level. And there have been no El Ninos since 1998 to 2015, which is astonishing because usually they happen every 3 to 4 years. So for some reason, the world got much hotter than usual, stayed stable, and then in 2015, with the first El Nino in 17 years, temperatures shot up again, and they've gone up even higher. Now, we've actually seen a pattern since about the 1980s of severe El Ninos causing jumps in global temperature to a new high level, like this happens. This has happened several times. The temperature goes up, stabilizes a new level, jumps up, and stabilizes a new high level. So we're seeing the hottest years in history. Since 2001, we've had 15 years in a row that have been record in the highest 15 of the 16 hottest years in a row. If you were to flip a coin, it's equivalent to flipping a coin 15 times and getting heads every time. The probability of that is extremely small, 0.0004 or 99.96% certain that temperatures are going up. So there's no doubt temperatures are shooting up and they're going to get higher soon, but they may stabilize around a new high level for a while and then shoot up in the next El Nino. So we're very concerned about what's happening because we've already lost most of the corals in the world to heat stroke from high temperature. It's getting worse and worse. Most of them are already gone. We can't take any further increase in temperature. When people talk about letting global temperatures rise 1.5 or 2 degrees higher, that means sentencing coral reefs to death. It's a death sentence for coral reefs. So we need to do something quickly to try to save corals. So I want to look now at the pattern of how temperature affects corals worldwide. But in the long run, we've got to deal with CO2. This is a graph for the last nearly 500 million years of CO2, and the estimates are pretty rough, but the thing is that the last few million years here in the ice ages, we've had very low CO2, but we're heading up now for levels that are up here in the past when global temperatures were 15 or 20 degrees C warmer than they are now. It was a super hot period, stuff that we couldn't tolerate, but we're pushing the CO2 back to what it was in the past under conditions that were much hotter than anything we've ever experienced or could tolerate. Now, what happened in 2015 is an interesting pattern. What this map shows is worldwide the maximum hotspot. Now, the hotspot is a method that I developed in 1990 to predict coral bleaching from the satellite sea surface temperature records. And what this shows is the maximum temperature over the average temperature in the warmest month of the year historically. And what you're seeing here is that in 2015, places got much hotter than normal, and in some cases, nearly 5 degrees C higher than the normal for that time of year. So this is the hottest it got worldwide. And if we look at areas where there were coral reefs, this is an interesting pattern. If we look at the areas that are essentially orange, these areas are hot enough to cause coral bleaching wherever corals happen. So for example, here's Hawaii. Hawaii lost most of their corals to bleaching in 2015. Most of the corals died. In Cuba, here Cuba's barely in the orange, but Cuba had bleaching all around Cuba and fairly serious mortality. There was bleaching over here in the Bahamas, there was bleaching here in Panama, so these little orange patches. There was very severe bleaching in Samoa, in Fiji, in Vanuatu, in New Caledonia, and in the Great Barrier Reef. Although, as you'll see later, that was mistakenly thought to have happened in 2016. There was severe bleaching in the Philippines and other places as well. So as you can see, wherever it's warm, in 2015, which is a record hot year, wherever it was unusually warm in coral reef areas, most of the corals died. Now, in 2016, the pattern was quite different. This is the year that's just over. And as you can see, Hawaii and Cuba were not excessively hot, and they didn't bleach at all. Panama did bleach, it's just making the orange, and the Bahamas, this corner of the Bahamas bleached, just making the orange. But as everyone knows, there was severe bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. Massive mortality. They lost something like 90% of the corals in the north, and down in the south, where it wasn't so hot, there was hardly any mortality. But the reefs were already dead down there for other reasons, so that's nothing to crow about. However, with all the hoopla that we're hearing about the Great Barrier Reef, the thing is that these are the areas where people normally dive. They very rarely go up north. And so in 2016, when these areas here suffered massive mortality, they went and surveyed the north and found all the reefs dead. But in fact, a lot of that mortality might have happened the previous year and not been surveyed. We hear a great deal about the mortality in the Barrier Reef, but in fact, the mortality in a large part of central Indonesia was far worse. I do a lot of diving there. Reefs that I work in here in Bali that had 100% live coral cover last year, completely covered with beautiful, healthy corals. When I got back this year to the same locations, they were 95 to 99% dead. And large parts of Bali and Lombok and these areas of central Indonesia essentially lost almost all their corals. 95 to 99% of the corals here died. We're not hearing about that. We're only hearing about the Barrier Reef. In Vanuatu, where I dived also last year, some places about anywhere from 20 to 40% of the corals died. Fiji lost a great, huge, massive coral mortality. The Maldives had tremendous coral mortality. And so did New Caledonia. So it's very severe. So far in 2017, we're only in the very beginnings of January. We're January 20th today. And in fact, what we're seeing right now in the South Pacific is very rapid warming taking place all over this area. All of the South Pacific, from the Great Barrier Reef to Tahiti, is now reaching bleaching temperatures. Okay, should continue? So far in 2017, bleaching temperatures have been reached all the way from the Barrier Reef to Tahiti. That includes New Caledonia, Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. It hasn't bleached yet. They're just reaching bleaching temperatures. It'll take a month at these temperatures for massive bleaching to be observed and before they start seeing large-scale mortality. Now, it could miraculously cool down in the next month or so and prevent that, but it's not likely because those areas are warming up very rapidly. So the stage is set right now for massive bleaching in the South Pacific this year. Now, the question is, what can we do about it? If bleaching happens in the Great Barrier Reef again this year, as is, I think, very likely at this point, they may lose almost all the corals that have been left. So we're in a very serious situation. How can we keep corals alive from bleaching? There's only one method that we know, and that's the Biorock method that uses electrical stimulation or electrotherapy that greatly increases the growth rate, the survival, and the resistance to stress of corals. We saw that in 1998 in the Maldives. We saw that in 2005 in Thailand. And in 2016, we saw it again in Indonesia. Now, what we're going to show next here are going to be videos of Biorock structures in Indonesia shortly before and shortly after the 2016 bleaching. The 2016 bleaching, as I say, it was, as you will see in these videos, when you compare them, the ones before and the ones after. The ones before show the spectacular coral growth and fish populations, and afterwards, almost complete survival of corals on Biorock, but almost complete mortality of corals without Biorock. Now, what you'll see here is actually several kinds of structures, because the Biorock structures we have, some have been maintained, and on those almost everything lived. Some of them have not had any power at all for various reasons, because cables were broken or power supplies burned out, and they didn't want to bother to fix them, so those ones had been left off power for a while, and on those almost everything died. And in addition, what you're going to see in these videos is another set of structures in which the power was on when the bleaching began, but halfway through the bleaching event, there was a severe storm, that damaged cables and damaged the power supply, and they didn't get around to fixing it until after the bleaching was over. So there's a set of reefs in addition that were protected with Biorock for half of the event, but not for the other half. And on those, most of the corals died, but many survived. It was an in-between survival. So it indicates that Biorock is the only method known that protects corals from dying from heat stroke. There's no other method known. I'd like you to look at these videos and see for yourself the incredible difference. Now, the point of this is that coral reefs can't take any further global warming. And we're going to lose almost everything we have in the next few years unless we start using the Biorock method on a large scale to protect reefs. It's not hard to do. And it's the only way that we know that we're going to be able to keep marine biodiversity alive and the ecosystem services that live corals provide: shore protection, biodiversity, fisheries, sand supply, and beaches. So we are, at this moment, desperately building what we call Biorock arcs, the coral arcs. We're trying to save all the species of the world of corals from dying from bleaching and global warming. It's the only method that we know that keeps them alive, and the sooner we do it, on the larger scale we do it, the more of a difference we can make. Thank you for listening. This is the Biorock Reef Restoration Project at Gili Trawaangan, Lombok, Indonesia. It's one of the world's largest coral reef restoration projects. There's more than 100 Biorock reef structures here, and each one is a different size and shape, and they range in ages. Some of these are only a few months old, others are up to 10 years, so you'll see a huge range. What you'll notice is that in all of them they're sitting on bare sand or barren rubble. There was essentially nothing here. The corals in this area had catastrophic mortality from bleaching in 1998 and bombing, and they were almost completely wiped out. So we restored this whole reef in an area where the corals and the fish had practically disappeared. That's a new structure, this one here. That's why it has so few corals on it. The corals we attached on it, this one's only maybe a few months or a year old at best, but the corals grow like mad. You can see in these older structures, the corals are growing and branching so prolifically you can't even see the underlying structure. We're often asked if turtles are attracted by our structures, or if our structures will kill turtles. Well, as you can see, turtles love our structures. They hang out on them. This turtle happily sits on them, and he moves from one structure to another. So it's clear that they appreciate them and the habitat that they create. So do the fish of all kinds. We build up huge fish populations very quickly. They hover over our structures. They have lots of place to hide inside and underneath. And so without the Biorock Reef here, there'd be essentially no fish for people to see. Well, here's a very happy turtle, and this is, I think, clear proof that turtles are not, don't avoid Biorock. They quite like it. Well, you can see these projects can be any size or shape. And I mean, many of these, you can't even see the structure. The coral growth has been so prolific. We're typically getting anywhere from 2 to 10 times faster growth than normal. We transplant small fragments of corals onto it, and you can see they just grow like mad. Clownfish, anemones, soft corals, everything moves in. The surrounding area has almost no hard corals. A lot of soft corals, but no hard corals. These structures that you see here now are completely overgrown. You can't even see the framework underneath. It's very impressive. I'll come back to these ones a little later in this video. Now we'll look at them again at the end. This is a brand new structure, as you can see from the bare material. Things settle on them spontaneously, and then we transplant small fragments of corals onto them, and they just grow like mad. So we've restored the whole reef and the whole fisheries and the whole tourism economy of this particular community, with more than 100 Biorock reefs and more than 30 or 40 dive shops. And they come here and they see turtles swing between beautiful corals and huge schools of fish in an area that had almost nothing when we began. It looked like this. This is a Biorock reef that has had the top smashed off by a boat. So all these were live corals that were broken. We transplanted corals from the top of that structure down below to a whole set of structures you see down here that you can't see them anymore. These are 3 years of coral growth. Around them is all soft corals. And these ones aren't getting power directly at all from Biorock. They're simply sitting in the electrical field itself. So that the structure at the beginning with the smash corals was getting charged. Here's the other electrode, and these other structures that we see here are far away from either of them, and they're not getting any direct power at all, but they themselves are being stimulated by the electrical field and growing much faster than normal. Here's a control structure with no corals put on it, and you can see the difference very clearly. The importance of this project is that what it shows is that the extremely rapid coral growth is not confined to the structures themselves. It covers the entire region all around them where the electrical field flows through the seawater. So in fact, by transplanting corals within the electrical field, we're able to restore vast areas of coral reefs very much larger than the actual structures we build in them. Those are only symbolic of a much larger beneficial restoration. These images, the photos we saw here, were taken by Delphine Robbe, who is the director of the Gili Eco Trust. It's a local community-based ecological management group in the Gili Islands. And she took these pictures, and she's been managing these more than 100 projects, as you can see, with great success. The video that we saw at the end that showed corals that had been transplanted onto structures in the field but not getting power was a project that was done by two of my students in collaboration, Saul Vitasari and Zach Kohlberg. And it's very interesting work, and we're continuing to follow it, and it indicates the tremendous possibility of biorock reef restoration, much greater than people realize. These are the Biorock coral reef restoration projects at Gili Trawaangan, Lombok, Indonesia. The structure you see here was designed by the late Wolf Hilberts about 10 years ago, but it hasn't been maintained under power. These photographs, all the video you're going to see here, was taken in October 2016 in Indonesia at the site of projects that are some of our early coral reef restoration projects as well as some of our latest ones. The ones you see here, unfortunately, have lost almost all their corals due to heat stroke. It was very hot in Indonesia early this year, and corals that weren't protected using biorock technology almost all died. These corals were alive less than a year ago, and they were beautiful, but they died from high temperatures. These are old projects that we had. They were doing magnificently for a long time, but unfortunately they weren't maintained, and as a result, almost all the corals died on them. And some of the reefs in Indonesia that I dived on this year, 95 to 99% of all the corals died. The survival was anywhere from 1 to 5%, and vast areas of reef that had been in absolutely perfect condition last year were graveyards this year just because of the high temperature that occurred for a few months early this year. So here, in this case, these projects weren't maintained. They were getting a small trickle of power from the shore. The cable was broken and wasn't repaired at some point in the past, and as a result, the corals, when the temperatures got hot, simply couldn't take it, and like the surrounding reef and the dead reefs all around it, they died. In this area in Gili Trawaangan in 1998, it was the last time there was severe bleaching. That's 18 years ago. At that point, there was extremely high water in Bali and Lombok and large parts of central Indonesia, and what happened then was what happened this year. Record high temperatures, and almost all the corals simply turned pale and died in the space of a couple weeks. They bleached and died, and they simply couldn't take it. When I first started diving in Indonesia around that period of time, the reefs that I looked at had everything dying or recently dead. And when we began restoring reefs in Indonesia nearly 20 years ago, this is what the reefs looked like. Dead corals with a few desperate fish hanging around, but very little alive. A graveyard of dead coral fragments all over the bottom. And 1% live coral cover in the background of hard corals. The hard corals are the things that build the reef. As you see here in these projects that didn't get power, there's not much action here. Now we're beginning to see some that were getting some power. These structures here, unlike the ones we saw before, have been getting a little power. They were getting power until June, and then the cable that was powering them got broken in a heavy storm. So they'd had some mortality, but they had electricity that protected them for quite a while. As you'll see, there's going to be a big difference between those corals that got partial power like this versus those that had none at all. You'll see here a lot more living coral and a lot more fish. As you see all around, there's essentially no living coral on the reef. Everything died in 1998, not only from bleaching and high temperature, but also from bombing. The fishermen actually bombed the reefs to pieces with dynamite. It was the height of the 1998 economic crisis, and so the corals were hit from two angles: bad fishing practices and high temperatures simultaneously. And when we began, it was like the areas in between these structures completely barren. Now we're getting to some biorock structures that have been under power all through the severe high temperatures that affected central Indonesia this year. And as you can see here now, these are covered with living corals and swarming with fish. They were exposed to the same conditions as other reefs you saw before that had very little on them. These ones here, we're getting a very small trickle of direct current from a charger on the shore, growing limestone rock, and as a result of that conditions that was set up here, that trickle charge of electricity has given the corals the strength to resist high temperatures, to resist bleaching, even though these are in very shallow water where it got very hot and they're exposed to very intense sunlight. These corals survived the bleaching. There's almost complete survival on the reefs getting electrical charges in Indonesia this year, and almost complete mortality of the same kinds of corals on the control structures and on the surrounding reefs. The fish aren't fooled by dead coral. They swarm to where the live coral is. In this case, you see the corals branching like mad, proliferating like mad, and they don't look as though they were just severely bleached under severe high temperature shock only a couple months ago, but in fact they withstood 4 to 6 months of severe high temperatures that killed most of the reefs and the surrounding natural reefs around them. So this is now an oasis of life, and as a result the fish have congregated on the surviving coral. They're not fooled by dead coral. They want to be where the coral is alive, so they just crowd right into these areas and build up very large populations. Quite apart from that, the fish are attracted by the electrical field itself. We build up fish populations systematically wherever there are biorock projects. The juvenile fish are attracted to the biorock structures, but what you also see is these huge schools of fish surrounding living coral, and these are constantly growing populations. They dash back into the coral for shelter. They don't do it if the coral's dead. You only see them around living coral. So here, in our particular biorock reefs, we've kept all the corals alive, and as a result, the fish just simply crowd around them. These projects here are especially interesting because there's a whole bunch of biorock structures in this area here that you can't even see. The coral growth in 4 years has been so prolific you can't see the underlying structure. And they've actually grown completely down and covered the ground. The areas between them don't have any hard coral at all. We transplanted them from structures like this that you see here, put very small fragments onto them, and in the space of a few years they just exploded with growth, fused together, and made huge mats of corals that were covering the entire sea floor in between. Now what's interesting is that this particular reef that you see us diving over here is one getting a very small trickle of power, but the other ones you saw that were down on the bottom below that, completely covered with corals, weren't getting any power at all. They were simply sitting in the electrical field of structures like this one that we've been powering with a very small trickle. And we were able to grow kilometers of reef using about as much electricity as a single air conditioner. So it's very little. So we're able to keep reefs alive when they would die from severe high bleaching like this. Full of corals, full of fish, and perfectly healthy and happy, while the surrounding areas have almost complete mortality. Again, these are reefs that we're growing here without even charging them directly. They're just simply sitting in the electrical field, and they're completely covered the tables, the steel tables that we transplanted them onto 4 years before. So we're able to greatly expand the reef under conditions where it would die. And because we can grow back whole reefs like this in the space of a couple years in places where there's no natural recovery, we can also grow back damaged reefs, protect shorelines. In doing so in Indonesia, doing work just like this, we've grown back severely eroded beaches in just a few months. By simply creating massive reef frameworks like this, where none were sitting before, you slow the waves down and the beach simply grows right back within a few months. So we had one beach that we grew back about 1.5 meters deep of sand and made it 10 meters wider. Literally, most of that happened in the space from January to April of this year. So I'd say the footage you see here was taken in October 2016 in Indonesia, in an area that has just been coming out of a severe, catastrophic, high-temperature, bleaching mortality of coral reefs due to global warming. And on our reefs here that are getting power, almost all our corals are alive. You look at the areas down below them and you see only dead coral rubble from the past. These are corals that weren't protected by our method, and they all died before, but the ones we're growing are perfectly happy. Now, the importance of this is that this is a short-term method by which we can keep corals and reefs alive despite global warming. We have limits, too, to how long we can keep them alive, but in this case, as you see, in the world's largest and richest coral reefs, we've kept whole reefs alive and whole fish populations where they've disappeared around them. And we're able to do so pretty much anywhere. Here you see more reefs have grown here. You don't even see the reef underneath them. So we've grown from small fragments just a few years before. Now, in doing so, we grow back beaches, we grow back whole fisheries. This technology also can be used to produce habitat for any number of fish or lobsters or giant clams. We can design them in site-specific ways to meet particular needs. We're often asked whether our biorock reefs affect turtles and wildlife. Well, the fact is that all forms of life are attracted to our reefs. You can see the fish come in huge numbers. They swarm right around them. The electrical field somehow attracts them. We don't even know how, but if the power's off for long periods of time, we get less fish. We turn the power back on, clouds of fish come back. These ones here are permanently breeding populations of fish here. They range from adult all the way to small. We get huge fish populations, everything from groupers and so forth live inside our structures. Some of them hide in the daytime and come out to feed at night. Others do the opposite. So we create, an oasis of life in short order. And that oasis also functions like a real coral reef does. It generates sand and protects the sand on the beaches from washing away. And so the result is we naturally are able to grow back beaches that have completely vanished, literally within months, by growing coral reefs like this right in front of them. And in cold waters, we do the same, although we don't grow coral reefs. We grow oyster reefs or seagrass or salt marsh. The Biorock technology actually, as you see here, is stimulating all forms of marine life. All forms, because what we're doing is we're stimulating the fundamental biochemical mechanism by which all forms of life make their energy. They do that through the biophysics of a small electrical current that flows from the outside to the inside of their cell, and that's how they make all their energy. And our reefs here are oases of positive charge and positive energy that are making everything attracted. They come here faster, they grow faster, they live longer, they survive environmental stresses that would kill them. As a result, we're able to restore whole ecosystems very quickly and maintain them alive, despite the challenges of global warming. We're losing almost all the coral reefs in the world right now due to high temperatures. And these reefs here that we've kept alive in Indonesia just by using a trickle of electrical charge that can be provided from land, from solar panels, from windmills, from tidal energy generators, and from wave energy generators, we can restore whole reefs around whole islands and grow back beaches and save islands from disappearing due to global sea level rise. That's our goal, is to work with communities to apply this technology in order to grow back their coral reefs and grow back their fisheries and grow back their islands. Now, as you'll see here, all forms of life love these reefs, and including turtles. People often ask if we frighten turtles away. Well, the answer is, as you'll see here very clearly, they're attracted to our structures. So please help us restore coral reefs all over the world. They have a technology now that can do it until global warming is controlled by reducing CO2 to safe levels. But until then, Biorock technology is the only technology we know of that keeps corals alive under severe high temperature conditions where they would otherwise die. And by doing so, by maintaining coral reefs alive, we're going to maintain the fisheries and their ecological services and the biodiversity of turtles just like this. Thank you for your help. This has been a film of the Global Coral Reef Alliance. This footage was taken by Komang Astika from Bali, Indonesia, from the Yayasan Karang Lestari. These projects were maintained by Delphine Robe of the Gili Eco Trust. I am Tom Garone.